From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV, our little conversation about Chicago and all the issues that we face as Chicagoans. I'm Ken Davis, and glad to be with you again for another week. As we're doing this show on Thursday morning, September 7th, we're watching as the largest hurricane ever is pointing itself right smack at Florida. Now, there's no way to know how much devastation it's going to inflict. We're all going to be watching that, and we'll be obviously worried about it. But on today's show, we're going to have the temerity to turn the cameras on ourselves and pay attention to our own city and wonder what would happen here if a calamity of this magnitude ever hit Chicago. Could we withstand 50 inches of rain over a couple of days? Could we withstand 150 to 180 mile an hour winds? And think about this. What would we do if our governor and our mayor were standing at the podium with all the top emergency officials around them and they were saying, get out now. If they issued a mandatory evacuation, where would we go? On what? The Dan Ryan, the Kennedy, on the Metra? Everybody get on the Blue Line, go to O'Hare? Michael Hawthorne's written about flooding and other problems in Chicago and the near completion of the deep tunnel. And he's here today to walk us through what a wetter future might mean for Chicago. And in a different water management crisis, the fact that practically every home in Chicago gets its water through a lead service pipe, and there are no current plans to replace any of them. Is that a problem? Well, we sure know that lead poisoning of our children is a real threat, and we'll talk about lead on the show today, too. Michael Hawthorne is an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune, but in terms of Chicago Newsroom, he's our calamity correspondent.
Oh, it's always good to be here. You know, as a colleague once said, it must suck being you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, people don't like when I show up
Right.
a lot of times.
Well, we've had you on the show several times, and every time you've been here to tell us how we're all going to die from something, some poisoning or something.
It's somebody's got to do it.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Yeah.
No, I don't want to make light of the fact that I am a huge fan of your work at the Chicago Tribune. I think you're a great environment writer. You've told us about pet coke and all the other things that are happening on the South Side. But you have also written very well, I think very elegantly, on the deep tunnel. And I've also been I've followed this project for years. In fact, in my 30 years ago when I was working in public radio, we actually did a broadcast from down in one of the pump.
Before they filled it up, right?
Yeah. So I've always been kind of, because I'm an infrastructure geek, I think it's just one of the most amazing things. But I thought I'd throw this question at you today after just rereading some of your stuff. It just occurs to me, you know how they talk about how generals fight the last war? Have we just finished a monster 30-year commitment to an infrastructure that will perfectly solve the problems of 1970?
No.
No.
That's the simple answer.
I thought it was a good question.
It is a great, I think, you know, the various things have been said over the years.
Yes.
When they had their cup out and they were asking Congress for money from the federal treasury, what was then called the sanitary district promised that the deep tunnel, the formal name is the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan, that it would bottle up rainstorms. And initially, at least, most of the money that they got from what was then the very new Federal Clean Water Act passed by Congress 1972. So that's how long ago this project's been in the works. And most of that money was supposed to initially just take care of the pollution that was going into the Chicago River and Lake Michigan. That was a really common occurrence from the days after the early 1900s when we reversed the river, a great engineering marvel, separated our sewage from our source of drinking water.
And sent it to New Orleans.
Yep, and went all the way to the Supreme Court with that. But what is happening increasingly is the type of storms that we're getting. I mean, the weather has changed, but the climate is changing as well. And the way it's changed in Chicago is that we get either long spells of heat or cold. Think of the polar vortex, or think of the 1995 killer heat wave. But we don't necessarily get as much rain or more rain than we used to, but we get it in shorter, more intense bursts. And that's really challenging our sewer system and the deep tunnel more than ever before. And the question now is what's now called the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. They're getting ready at the end of this year. It's going to be a big milestone, several milestones over this very long, nearly half-century process and a massive construction project for almost $4 billion. At one point, I think before the big dig in Boston, which was a tunnel under Boston Harbor, the deep tunnel was the most expensive public works project in American history.
We were proud of that. I mean, Chicago bragged
I think in many
that.
ways we
Right.
still are.
Right.
I think you can see, many plaques on bridges and things like this, or above vents along the Chicago River if you're paying attention. The question now is they're going to open the first part of this giant reservoir in southwest suburban McCook. And that's hooked up to tunnels up to 30 feet in diameter that are, deep below city streets, all the way up to Wilmette. So it winds, northeast toward downtown, and then up, along essentially the North Branch of the Chicago River, the North Shore Channel. You think about a good swath of Cook County in the city. It's also going to be handling the Des Plaines River in Cook County. All of that runoff, all of that sewage during a rainstorm is supposed to somehow fit through, even though it's this giant tunnel. All of that water is supposed to get to McCook and somehow prevent flooding and prevent basement backups and prevent pollution going through sewage pipes into the river, and then during the worst storms end up in our lake. They're not quite clear whether that's going to happen. It's worked okay in a smaller system in the Calumet region. That's been online now for a little more than a year. But the type of storms they had down there haven't been as intense, the way that the storms have hit the area. So I think the question is, when we get these really intense storms that are projected to become more frequent as the climate keeps changing, as the earth keeps getting warmer, that can we handle that? And have we spent this money in vain? The answer from people from the city, from the Water Reclamation District, is no, it's money well spent. The problem could be a heck of a lot worse if we didn't have this.
Yeah, I mean, if you could just suddenly erase it, we'd be in a lot worse shape than we are now, if you just took it away.
But what's interesting is now a lot of the people, the naysayers, who, let's put it this way, the people who criticized the types of infrastructure improvements that today are called green infrastructure. Groups like the Center for Neighborhood Technology and Scott Bernstein, people who have been around infrastructure issues, social issues in Chicago for a long time. Back when they were trying to get money for the deep tunnel, they were saying, look, this is not going to work. This is not the panacea. This is not going to bottle up rainstorms. You can't tame Mother Nature. And what's interesting is as this project is dragged slowly toward being completed, finally, it won't be actually finally completed until 2029 under a federal consent decree. So it started in 1975 and goes all the way to 2029. It's probably not going to prevent all these things. It's not going to prevent the local basement backups in a neighborhood if it gets really hit by a strong rainstorm. So how do you deal with that? And what other cities are doing, cities like Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Seattle, is they're incorporating these green infrastructure improvements, essentially keeping the water out of the sewer system in the first place. And so you do little things along the streets. The parking lanes are made with permeable pavement, or there are these things called rain gardens that are kind of, they collect water, kind of let it filter slowly back into the sewers, give the system a break. And it's projected to be a real problem because even with the deep tunnels in place, they've been in place for more than a decade now. The city a few years ago did a modeling projection of how the local sewers, the sewers that are actually on your street, how they could handle a storm. And they figured out that 2/3 of an inch overwhelms most sewers in the city.
The first sewers, the smaller sewer lines.
The ones that are out in front of your house, when you flush the toilet, when you take a shower, where the water goes afterwards. And when those sewers fill up, that's when you get basement backups, and that's still a very common occurrence in Chicago, and it's really messy and can be potentially a threat to your health.
We could go. we talk about your sewers. We could go down the sewer rabbit hole
We
here
could, we
because
could.
we're both obviously infrastructure geeks, and we could talk about the fact that about 10 years ago, maybe a little more, I know Daley started this thing of putting the restrictors in all the catch
the rain
basins,
blocker
the rain
program.
blocker,
Right.
And if I'm not mistaken, that was a terrible mistake, and they went back and pulled a lot of those out.
I think
is that true?
what it was, I don't know if it was a terrible mistake, but I don't know if they communicated it to people in the neighborhoods very effectively, because a lot of aldermen were very upset because their constituents were upset that streets were full of water.
Right.
The idea was it was going to
hold
the water,
streets
basically
as-
use the
right,
street as a
right.
as a little reservoir.
Right.
So that's another example of how we've kind of MacGyvered the situation along the years.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the ultimate one is that we still have all of these sewer pipes that go directly into the Chicago River, and President Obama, Mayor Emanuel, Mayor Daley, they all talked about how the Chicago River is supposed to be this clean, wonderful place for recreation. By law now, that's a designated part of several parts of the river. And a story that I did earlier this year found that, I mean, one storm in July, there was enough raw sewage and runoff that came into the north branch of the river that it could have covered the loop in muck about 8 feet deep.
Really? Wow, that's amazing.
That's staggering.
And of course,
that's one storm.
again, exercising our geekery here, part of the problem is that as an older city, we don't have separate sewer systems.
We made a decision a
combined-
long time ago to do that. And,
so your toilet runs into the same sewer as the
gutter in your
the
house.
gutter from your house,
Exactly.
or just from when you wash the car and it goes down. Everything.
And
all
we
goes
built
in
the
one
city
place.
on a swamp too. So
Yes, there's that too.
There is
Right,
that.
right. But we didn't care because we had the Chicago River to dump it into, and we had the
And
lake,
the lake.
to dump it into.
Yeah,
and,
right.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden we started worrying about stuff like that. So anyway.
At least we don't have the typhoid outbreaks like
That's
we used
right,
to,
right. So, well, and it's easy for us, smug little people that we are, 100 or 150 years later, to be sitting here and sniffing about this. But the fact of the matter is that these massive engineering projects have been miraculous.
in many ways, I agree.
They've done.
And in many
they've
ways,
allowed this city to
the
exist.
Chicago region pioneered a lot of things that
Right.
later
Right.
have become kind of standard issue
Yeah.
in the rest of the world,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
But David St. Pierre, who's the current executive director of the Water Reclamation District, when I push him on some of these issues about why some of these problems are still happening, he kind of has a wry answer, and he says, well, we're a continuous improvement industry.
I like that.
So,
and it's true.
It is true.
It is true. We learn all the time, and we get new technologies, and and tunneling is becoming easier. The machines are getting more and more efficient.
They're
So maybe they'll
building a
just
new
build more
tunnel.
tunnels.
They're building a new tunnel on the north side because the kind of the more natural or less unnatural part of the Chicago River often floods up on the northwest side, and so they've been drilling a new tunnel that will, when the river gets too high, the water will go into this tunnel and go straight to the North Shore Channel, which has more carrying capacity.
This is the thing along Foster that
Yeah, exactly.
This is because of Albany Park's flooding.
Exactly,
right? Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
supposed to at least
Right.
help alleviate
Right,
the flooding in
right,
that neighborhood,
right,
which
right.
is significant.
Yeah,
At any
yeah.
time, it really rains a fair amount.
So anyway, my question is, I don't suppose that there's any likelihood that we'd ever get hit with Houston-type water, because I don't think we'll ever see
we don't have. By the
something-
time it hits land, any kind of hurricane force winds, they always, being on land saps their energy, and what we usually get is we might get more rain. If you look at some of the projections for Irma, right now at least, by Sunday or Monday, the effects will be felt in southern Kentucky, for example.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it could change our weather, make it a little wetter for a while.
Yeah, it's just kind of frightening, because it really does feel like we are at the beginning phases of something completely new that we don't really understand. I mean, maybe that's stupid, and we'll look back at it 20 years from now and say, look how we were all weirded out about this, and we didn't need to be. But I mean, it just feels like the next Irma might just come right up the Mississippi or something, and we could, if it doesn't actually hit us, it it could have effects that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and I think still for us, the projections in the Chicago region, at least, the projections are more rain in shorter increments or more protracted periods of drought.
Yeah,
so that's probably what's going to end up
And
happening.
you know, again, I guess I'm sort of making fun of it, but you know, we have no infrastructure for mass evacuation because we've just never really
And we've
thought
never
that
really,
it was important.
we haven't
right?
needed it.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can't
We're
imagine.
not, we're not Monroe County, Florida.
Right, that's right.
We're not on a peninsula
Right.
or anything else
Yeah,
like that.
Barrier
so-
Island or
right,
something.
Right.
But
We might get lake effect snow. That's about it.
yeah. Well, anyway, I just to tell you the truth, I use that as a good excuse to bring you in today so we could talk about some of these other things.
Okay, sure.
Because we're very concerned about weather, and I think you as a scientist you probably are you're one of those radicals who believes that there's climate change.
Well, I think that not me. I don't think that there's a belief. It's what science tells us.
It's just a belief. It's just something you believe. I mean, you can't prove it. You can't prove that there's climate change. You know, well, anyway, let's not go down that deep tunnel.
That could fill up a few shows.
Let's just completely radically change topics and talk about something that you've written about so well over such a long period of time, and that is lead. There are two buckets of lead stuff to talk about. There's lead pipes and lead in our water, and then there's lead that's in our environment that comes from mainly paint, but other pollutants that we breathe or otherwise get into our bodies. And it's all about getting lead into our bodies, and it's all about the youngest among us, babies mostly, and what happens when they're exposed to lead. Do you want to start with lead pipes, or you want to start with the other stuff?
Let's just start with the overall problem.
Okay.
I think what really got me interested in this subject was a few years ago when the murder rate had been plummeting for many, many years, not only in Chicago but worldwide. The violent crime rate plummeted, and all of a sudden we had this uptick. And people were struggling to figure out why that was happening, and nobody could really figure out why. Was it police tactics? Was it poverty? And there were all these things are factors. But if you look at the actual research on any of these things, it gets kind of fuzzy. And the one thing that was really compelling to me is the research on both the way lead affects our brains. And then also a lot of correlating research on human behavior, like crime or educational achievement. And so we have this situation in Chicago where we have very poor neighborhoods with schools that aren't what they should be, and a lot of violence, and a lot of lead-poisoned children, it turns out, compared to other parts of the city. And so a couple of years ago...
And it's important to point out that the lead-poisoned children physically line up with these other problems. They're not to be found in Lincoln Park or Portage
one
Park.
example is, well, it used to be a citywide problem.
Well,
it
that's
used to
my
be a
point.
problem. You and I were
Right.
lead poisoned as
Right.
children because we had leaded gasoline. So we both
Right.
lost a few IQ
That's right,
points,
right.
and people who read the paper sometimes
Yeah.
would say that's it shows.
Yes, it does.
But it's all relative now, and what the science says is that it takes less lead than what they once thought to actually permanently damage your brain.
I just want to keep you. I want to prevent you from moving forward until we get to this point. You had written in the past, and I found this so compelling, that if you compared, I guess, building records and so forth, housing units that were in Lincoln Park were about as lead contaminated in
the mid-'90s.
In the mid-'90s.
That recently.
As those in Englewood or Austin or anywhere
Lawndale,
else.
yeah.
But because of economics, because other communities developed quickly, and I defy you to find a house in Lincoln Park today that hasn't been rehabbed since 1990. So the lead problem has been evaporating in areas where there's money to be spent, but not so much so in areas where there has not been money
And then these
spent.
are a lot of areas where, for example, they tore the public housing high-rises down and shifted people into, we talked about it before the show, scattered site housing, or what was for many years called Section 8 housing. But many of those private homes where people could get a voucher to pay for a good part of their rent, they're homes that were built before 1978 when lead paint was banned in the United States.
And they probably weren't
And they're not kept up
thoroughly
well. I've
rehabbed,
been
let's put it
in
that way.
dozens of them, and they're not necessarily kept up very well. And
But I mean,
so peeling paint is a problem.
I just want to hammer this point because I think it's really important. In an area where a house would be purchased or an apartment building would be purchased and rehabbed, the interior of that building would be gutted. The paint and the plaster and the windows most likely would be in a dumpster and long gone.
The windows
And, especially windows. But the lead paint that's in the building would either have been thoroughly encapsulated, covered with many coats of newer paint, or removed completely. But in the stuff we're talking about, the houses that are being used today as Section 8 housing or
Or just
voucher housing,
houses for people that have less means.
with less means, were not, if they were rehabbed at all, they were not rehabbed in the same to the same thoroughness, let's put it that way.
Yeah, unless there was a fire. For example,
Right.
I was in a home in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood a couple of years ago where a young child was found to be lead poisoned. I was along with a health department inspector as they were trying to figure out where the child had picked up the lead. And as he was going through the house, he immediately saw the cracking kind of alligator print almost on the windows. And windows are a big problem because they're opened and closed so much, and the friction and the paint starts wearing off.
And it gets into the
oftentimes
air.
when they're doing renovations to try to prevent further lead poisoning, they go to the windows first because that's a big problem. But as the inspector moved toward the back of the house, he noticed that the windows had been replaced toward the rear of the house. Well, it turned out that a previous tenant, there was a fire, and the whole back of the house had burned down. And when they renovated it, they just renovated the part that had burned down.
Just fix the part you need to fix.
So if the kid would have spent his entire time in the back of the house, he would have been probably okay, but instead he had fairly high levels of lead poisoning.
So let's go back. I cut you off when you were starting to talk about what we know about the effects of lead on young children and the behavioral changes that they engender.
Yeah, so there's a sociologist, criminologist that is written really extensively about the Englewood neighborhood. He's been following people in the Englewood neighborhood for more than 25 years now. His name's Rob Sampson at Harvard. And in part because of the research that the Tribune did in terms of looking at the shifting of lead poisoning rates from 1995 to 2013 by census block groups, so smaller than neighborhood areas. You can see that lead poisoning essentially disappear from the wealthier neighborhoods of the city. And while it still declines in, say, Englewood or parts of Austin, Lawndale, while it's declined from what it was in the mid-90s, it's still significantly higher than the citywide average, the current citywide average. In some cases, 1 of every 5 kids instead of 8 of every 10 kids are poisoned. And that's still a pretty sizable number. And Sampson has gone back and looked at the people that he's been following since they were young kids in Englewood. And one of the first papers that came out from applying lead poisoning to his earlier research is he summed it up by saying that lead paint or lead poisoning is a way that racial inequality literally gets inside the body. And so, and other people in both education and criminology that I've talked with is you have kids that are born into or growing up in situations where they have so many things against them already: deep poverty, parents who aren't working, broken homes, kids going back and forth between grandma and aunt and mom and dad.
Inferior schools.
Schools that are overcrowded or far away, not that great. And then you have this kick in the gut, as one researcher put it, where their brain is permanently scrambled at a very early age because they've played on the ground like any kid does, and they've ingested lead paint or lead dust. And their brain has been irreparably damaged in parts of the brain that control your impulses, that emotional control, that allow you to pay attention. So, you know, a normal 2-year-old has issues with that anyway, but making it worse, and then that compounds itself as a child grows older. And there's research out of the University of Cincinnati where they've been following kids since they were in the womb, and they found that when they were in their school age years, they did more poorly on standardized tests. They tended to fail grades more frequently. And when they got older, when they were in their teen years and early 20s, they committed not only crime, but violent crimes at a far higher rate than kids who weren't poisoned. And they're now finding some of these people are now in their 30s, well past the time when the peak crime committing age happens. And they're still caught in this kind of maelstrom of crime and poverty. And some of the participants have talked with the researchers about, you know, I just don't understand why I get so mad all the time, or why I'm always fighting with everyone. And it raises an interesting question. Can we kind of go to the low-hanging fruit? This is something that we know that we can control. We can't necessarily control jobs in a neighborhood. We can't necessarily control whether people have easy access to guns. We can do things by trying to prevent them from being lead poisoned. We know what to do. And while there's been a great amount of progress in that area, kind of like what we talked about at the beginning of the show, we don't necessarily have the same massive problems with flooding and overflows that maybe we once did. That's perhaps a debatable topic because of the way rainstorms are changing. But on lead poisoning, we made great success. Some public health people, the Illinois Department of Public Health, would say that combating lead poisoning, one of the greatest public health victories of the 20th century. But we still have thousands of children in the city of Chicago who start out life very early on with a very preventable condition that is going to cause problems that cost society, that cost us, that cost taxpayers a heck of a lot more money in the long term.
It's interesting because you pointed out that, I mean, that there have been, there have been incredible policy victories in lead poisoning, because if you think about 30, 40 years ago, there was lead in gasoline, there was lead virtually everywhere in our environment, and it was legislated away. And it went away pretty quickly in some ways.
Yes.
But if you happen to be someone who's trapped in a part of a city where the law just doesn't quite reach as effectively as it does in other ways, you're still as subject to it as we would have been in 19,
In some respects, that's true.
Yeah.
In some respects, that's true. And you can see there's a great research paper by a guy named Howard Mielke. He's at Tulane University, and he was integral. He did a lot of the research that led to the phase out of lead in gasoline. But he took the violent crime rate in different cities in America, and he took the amount of lead in the air. There was great amount of data with this. And both of those trends over time look like an inverted U, an upside down U, but they're about 23 years apart. So as the amount of lead in the air started going up, then 23 years later, the aggravated assault rate essentially followed the same trend.
Yeah.
And about 20 years after lead and gasoline started declining in the air, that's when the violent crime rate in Chicago and other places dropped. So the question is, in a lot of cases, why in some of these cities, Baltimore, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Chicago,
older cities,
why is it gone up? Why are places like Los Angeles and New York, places that are heck of a lot bigger than Chicago, their crime rates in general keep going down. New York, the murder rate keeps going down. Ours kind of plateaued last year. That's a great sign. It's nowhere near still. I find this unfathomable. It's nowhere near what it was in, say, 1992, which was the peak,
right,
the peak
was.
era.
But that raises some interesting questions about, I mean, certainly New York must have an equal proportion of lead poisoning in its older building stock.
It's actually, that's true, but there is a smaller percentage of children under 6 who are lead poisoned in New York than in Chicago,
and
with a much greater population.
And your theory about that is what?
That's a good question. I think they have attacked the issue earlier and more aggressively than Chicago has. I put this to Mayor Emanuel several times. He made a big point when he was running for re-election that his commitment to social justice, as he put it, was encouraged by his father, and the example of his father helping lead a campaign to get lead paint banned in the city of Chicago. So my question to him was, why is the city of Chicago spending less money combating lead poisoning today than it did back then? Now, there are fewer kids being poisoned than there were in the late 70s. That's true. But in the same neighborhoods where the headlines are constantly about violence and poverty and poor performing schools, there is a disproportionate number of kids that are starting out life behind.
Our guest is Michael Harrington, for those of you listening
Hawthorne.
to us. Did I say Harrington?
That's okay.
Did I say Harrington?
I think you did, but that's okay.
Thank God. Harrington.
I've been called other things.
I'm
but that's
so
okay.
sorry. Our guest is Michael Hawthorne. He's the environment writer for the Chicago Tribune, and I grew up in the '60s, so I have a perfectly good excuse. I lived in Humboldt Park in the '60s, so I mean I don't know how many brain cells I lost. And we are talking about these issues and want to pursue them a little bit further.
Well, you wanted to talk about water a little bit too.
Michael is I should say the environment writer and a investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune. But before we go there,
Okay.
do we know? Has it been medically or clinically proven that lead has these demonstrable effects on behavior later on?
Yes.
I mean, we talk about that stuff about, well, it just makes you more antisocial and blah, blah, blah. What are the characteristics of someone who is lead poisoned sitting next to someone who is not?
So they tend to perform more poorly in a lot of standardized tests. Cognitive tests. One of the best studies in Chicago, there was a researcher who formerly headed the lead program under Mayor Daley. She managed to get the early lead testing data from 52,000 children in Chicago public schools, and then found a different way a way with folks at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago to compare their rates of lead poisoning or their amount of lead poisoning as a child with how they performed in 3rd grade. And every slight increase in the amount of lead that these children were exposed to, or that was in their bodies when they were 1-2 years old, increased their chances of failing 3rd grade by almost a third.
Wow.
And these are kids that were in 3rd grade in 2003 to 2006, so they're kids that today would be in their mid-20s, if my math is correct. Yeah. And what I found even more staggering about that research is that about 3/4, the average level of lead poisoning in about 3/4 of Chicago public schools that were open at the time, this is among those 3rd graders, the average was above what the Centers for Disease Control and Protection says is a threshold where kids should be medically monitored, where inspectors should be visiting their homes. That's a lot of lead-poisoned kids
That is.
that are living in this city today and now are in their early to mid-20s.
And I want to move on, but I can't. I keep thinking of other things I want to talk about. One thing, quick thing. I know that a few years ago, the city of Chicago had a program with tax credits fed through, I guess, the federal government into the city for landlords and owners to lead abate their buildings, replace windows and all that kind of stuff.
Not much has become of that. Every now and then there's the Housing and Urban Development, Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. They occasionally give out grants for lead abatement. When Mayor Daley announced the plan for transformation to tear down the CHA high rises and put people into private housing, subsidized housing, there was a plan then, according to the CHA and Daley administration documents, that they were going to help clean up the lead in these places. They never followed through with money. Money's always been a problem in this area, and even in the Obama era, I think it's fair to say that several years ago, the Obama administration, when they released their proposed budget, they significantly cut the amount of money devoted to lead poisoning prevention and screening nationwide. Mm-hmm. And these were the grants that most local health departments get.
I think there's a kind of a general thing of, that problem's solved.
Exactly.
Right?
Even among the people, Obama people, they knew the issue. The president himself, when he was a young community organizer in the city of Chicago, worked on lead poisoning issues in Altgeld Gardens.
In Altgeld Gardens,
side.
exactly right.
And yet they merged this with an asthma prevention program and significantly cut their proposed budget. The Congress went even further and just zeroed it out to almost nothing, to the point where the city of Chicago wasn't getting any federal money for 2 or 3 years. The number of inspectors that the city of Chicago has, the health department has now, they've got 10 inspectors. I've gone to housing court, administrative hearing, the administrative hearing building. Every week there are people in court or at the administrative hearings because a child was poisoned by lead in their home. So the problem hasn't gone away.
Yeah. And I promise I'll get off of this. This will be the last thing. But you talked about, and you have just an excellent article. You have several of them, but I just go to the Chicago Tribune and look up Michael Hawthorne, not Harrington, Hawthorne, and all these articles will scroll by and you can read them. And I thoroughly encourage you to read all of them. The one that really stood out to me was this, and we've touched on it, but I want to go back and get a little bit more detail, is this notion that the CHA, of course, obviously the plan for transformation or plan for removal or whatever you want to call it, destroyed tens of thousands of dwelling units and moved some people, if they were lucky enough to get a voucher, into the private market. So in other words, the city essentially privatized public housing to a very large degree and turned it over to private landlords. And this is what we're talking about. They're moving into places that were lightly renovated at best and really are probably problematic. And it even occurs to me that if you were lucky enough to live in, say, Cabrini Green or one of the later built high-rise public housing, you probably had a better chance of escaping lead poisoning living in a place like that.
Not necessarily. That's
No?
that's the sad reality of the CHA was under a federal consent decree for lead poisoning before they tore the high-rises down. The largest lead poisoning verdict in Cook County history was a resident of the Abla homes, a young boy who was severely mentally retarded, and the jury found that lead poisoning is what caused that. So it was a problem that existed before, in part because, like you said earlier, we had a heck of a lot of lead in this city, in this country. What we found, though, that when one of the things that they said that when they were shifting low-income residents out of the public high-rises or public housing developments into this private home network, Mayor Daley said it was going to rebuild their souls. And one of the things that they did was they promised that before people moved in, because so much taxpayer money was going to be going to the landlord, that the home would be thoroughly inspected. And what we found was that they're really stringent about certain things. You can have your subsidies, your taxpayer subsidies as a landlord, revoked pretty quickly if there's a hole in the roof, or the heat doesn't work, or there's not a lock on the front door. Lead poisoning, you can get around to it later, is essentially the CHA's message. And as a result, these homes are inspected and the lead hazards aren't remediated. They might find cracking paint, but they don't necessarily have any kind of financial incentive, the landlord, to do anything about it, because the CHA is not going to dock them or kick them out of the program for that. And so what we found is that there were several dozen homes in the last several years where a landlord in the city of Chicago was getting significant amounts of money from the federal government, passed through the CHA, to rent a home to a CHA Section 8 voucher recipient, at the same time that the Chicago Department of Public Health was conducting an inspection, or in many cases dragging the landlord into court because a child had been poisoned by lead in that home. There are ways to stop this from happening. Advocates like the Shriver Center and folks from Loyola University Law School petitioned the federal government to change the rules. Right now, there's something called the visual inspection. Essentially, that's all. The inspector walks in. Oh, it looks good to me. When the health department shows up, they have a kind of a handheld gun. It looks like a phaser from the old Star Trek show, called an XRF gun, and they can just point it at a surface, click the trigger, and it will tell you how much lead, the percentage of lead in that surface.
That's pretty cool.
You can even go to Home Depot or Lowe's or Ace Hardware and get a pack
testing
of lead
kit.
wipes, and you swipe it and it turns a certain color if there's lead there.
Yeah.
They don't do that at the CHA. They don't do that at the federal HUD. And there were all these promises in the tail end of the Obama administration to take care of that. Ben Carson, the new HUD secretary, said during his confirmation hearings that he understood this subject and that it was going to be one of his top priorities. But nothing has happened in this new era, this new administration yet on this issue. So for now, the CHA hasn't been doing anything differently than it was before, and landlords are essentially let off the hook for lead hazards.
And they still get paid. And there was this thing. Tell me about this thing about lead levels getting kind of ignored if they're up to about like 4 times the standard.
Well, that's been fixed. That at least has been fixed. They could HUD could fix that administratively. But in my research on lead poisoning, oddity in the federal housing code came up where HUD had failed to update a Reagan-era standard for intervening if a public housing tenant had a child who was poisoned. The level now was 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. HUD's level was still 20.
I see. Okay.
And so let's say a kid went to his pediatrician and the level was 10 or 15 or even 18 or 7. Nothing would happen. HUD wouldn't do anything. HUD wouldn't order, and as a result, the CHA wouldn't do anything. So they changed that. There was a family from the Lawndale neighborhood that I profiled that multiple kids in the family were poisoned, and they were poisoned below the HUD standard at the time, but above the CDC, the accepted federal government standard. Just didn't make a lot of sense, and that was easily ultimately fixed within the calendar year.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And of course, as you've reported, there are all of these cases where people who are living in these whatever you want to call them, these scattered site places, they're just having horrendous problems, and they're calling in the city inspectors, and the city inspectors are finding all sorts of problems, but it doesn't translate to the CHA. They're not
I think
talking
it all
to each
comes
other.
back. All of this comes back to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier. It's this idea that this is a problem from the last century, or a problem that we've taken care of. You have to remember, lead's on the periodic table of elements. It doesn't go away.
It's still around.
And we emitted a heck of a lot of lead from factories and out of our automobile tailpipes. And we have lead in our homes and our water pipes, and our paint was full of lead. And people knew in the last century, in the early part of the last century, that this was a problem. But in a scenario that was repeated by many other industries, tobacco industry, chemical industry, the lead industry pioneered a campaign of deception and of confusion, essentially, to keep their products streaming into our homes and into our environment.
My dear mother, as an immigrant lady in the United States of America, got a job at a plant that still stands next to the 606. It's now the Kimball Arts Center, but when she worked there, it was the Atlas Collapsible Tube Company, and she made lead toothpaste tubes.
Oh,
and this would have been in...
Right on your teeth.
This would have been in 1958, 60, something like that. So not that long ago. I mean, we were using... Lead was just everywhere.
Right, exactly.
So, and God knows how much lead that little factory put into the environment over there around North and Kimball.
Definitely into our mouths.
Yeah, right. That's for sure. So let's talk about the other thing, and we have just a few minutes, but we had to take short shrift here somewhere. Let's talk about this lead pipe thing. Of course, Flint brings it into our attention. We see what happens when you stop putting the chemical into the system.
Flint was an example of a public water system that was criminally mismanaged. But there are other problems in a lot of other places, and actually the epicenter for those problems are right here in Chicago. We have more lead service lines. Those are the pipes that bring water from the main underneath the street to our homes. We have more of those than any other city in America.
Good for us.
I can't believe this, but I guess I can. In a very Chicago way, we were installing lead. We were actually, the plumbing code of the city of Chicago, the building code of the city of Chicago actually required them until 1986, the very day that they were banned by the Congress.
And that's probably because there were a bunch of plumbers who didn't really like this newfangled copper stuff.
Well, so there is speculation that lead required skilled labor, copper didn't.
Right, exactly. Yes. Everybody, that's been the history of all building stuff. It's like, electrical, wiring that doesn't require pipe fitters and all that.
So the issue here is we have all these lead pipes. Why aren't we doing anything about them? Right. In places like Flint, Madison, Wisconsin, Lansing, Michigan, they've actually, as cities, made conscious efforts to start removing them. And you could make an argument, we've made an argument in the pages of the Tribune, that we have a great opportunity right now because the city's in the midst of a massive infrastructure overhaul. We're replacing hundreds of miles of old, very old cast iron water mains. In some cases, some of them, turns out they're wood because they're from the days of right after the Great Chicago Fire. Replacing these with cast iron pipes, hooking them back up on every street to a lead service line. And research by the EPA and other private researchers has shown that, interestingly enough and alarmingly enough, that street work actually dislodges the protective coating that water systems like Chicago's put into their water supply to essentially coat the inside of these lead pipes and prevent the flakes of lead or the particles of lead from flaking off. When they're doing this street work, when they're putting a new water main on your street, or they're maybe ComEd's digging and doing something on your street, that's disrupting the pipe, and high levels of lead can flow out of your tap for days or even months afterward. Nothing's being done about it. Other places they are. In the city of Milwaukee, the mayor has said that anybody with a lead service line should have a water filter, and they should only drink water that is filtered. They're actually passing out free filters to people with children or pregnant women, children 6 and younger.
Well, it's interesting because...
And we're not doing anything. The city basically says everything is fine, nothing to see here, move along.
As you know, a similar situation is going on with the gas company all through Chicago and the suburbs, all over the place, where all of the underground lines to every house are being replaced and an outside meter is being put on. I know this because I went through this for almost a year. And believe me, I'm not trying to complain about this because I know you've all been through it too. We've all had this problem where the front of your house is dug up for months at a time because they're putting in these new plastic mains and then they shoot the line through to your basement and everything else. It is incredibly disruptive, especially if you happen to have a nice landscape the way I do at my house. But
right.
Let's not get.
You take a lot of good care of it.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, I can only imagine the uproar that would happen with the city if people all of a sudden were told, we have to come into your basement, rip a hole in your wall, and drill a new, new pipe in.
Certain cities have figured out how to do that. Boston right now does that. Mm-hmm. Hey, this is a map. This is a map of where the lead service lines are.
Yeah.
If you are concerned about your family's health,
Mm-hmm.
and you,
well put.
Right, if you're concerned about your family's health, you can apply to have your lead service line replaced.
Mm-hmm.
The city will come out and will essentially split the cost.
Mm-hmm.
The argument that the city of Chicago makes is that it's a private issue.
Well, sure,
because it's your private property.
Right.
Of course, once again, as I said earlier, the city building code required the use of lead.
Right.
So it was the stated legal policy of the city of Chicago to require a known neurotoxin to bring water into your home until 1986.
Right.
So if your home was built after 1986, you're okay. If not, you might want to think about getting a filter.
But it's interesting that some time ago, not that long ago, within the last 20 years or so, the city came up with this program to replace the drain in your house and to split it 50-50 with you, right? So if
there's a precedent for that.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
true.
if your house drain backs up and because it's all crunched up or something, you can have the city come out and replace it for you and only charge you half. So I mean, the mechanism is there.
Yes.
Yeah, but.
We've made no small plans before.
That's right, yeah. And I will say that this is one of these places where I actually get a little sympathetic for the mayor because there are just some times when you just can't do good no matter what you try. I mean, they did pass a massive increase in the water rates so that they could replace all these lines that
needed
have been,
to be done.
Have been neglected for 100 years.
And weirdly enough, we actually, even though the rate was doubled, more than doubled, and we've been taxed on top of that to help pay off the pensions, we still pay some of the lowest water rates in America.
Yeah.
Weirdly enough, Flint, the criminally managed water system, had some of the highest water rates in the country.
Yeah. Too cheap to meter. At least it used to be. But anyway, the thing is that we are in this situation where we have more of these service lines. And again, I think it's important to point out that we're talking about the piece of pipe that you've probably never seen that comes from the basement wall inside your house, runs underground out to underneath the street and connects to the main. And it's probably,
It
10
depends
or
on
15
how
feet
big your
long
front
or
yard
something.
is, essentially, or where they've put them.
Right.
There was one house in Flint that had stratospherically high levels of lead, and when they were essentially doing kind of a forensic investigation, they figured out that the lead service line went out to the street and then somehow down to the corner.
Oh, really? And connected in.
So there was a lot of lead there for the water to sit in before it got to the tap.
I mean, what happens now in Chicago? Is this ever going to become a political issue enough that there's going to be a program?
Well, we've got a water department right now that's rocked by scandal because they had a bunch of top individuals trading racist emails and whatnot.
So they were busy. They just were busy with the wrong things.
But they're still replacing. They're still digging up streets. They're still replacing water mains. They're still installing new sewers. The work goes on. The question that I've heard from a lot of people that would describe themselves as fairly conservative is hey, if you're going to tear up my street, don't keep tearing it up. Take care of the problem. I think they've got themselves so wrapped up in essentially the goodness of what they provide, the effort that they undertook in the last century, and it's amazing. There's a fellow that just sent me his the cover of his new book. It's on the brick tunnel that they built to extend the water cribs out into the lake to bring our water out, to keep it away from the shore, to keep it away from what then was the sewage coming out into the lake.
And that was in
amazing,
what, 1880 or something?
Right, and we still have that benefit.
Right.
We still have great water when it leaves the treatment plants. Now, there are other things that they keep finding in the environment, other chemicals they keep finding in the environment that aren't regulated, that show up in our water. Pharmaceutical drugs, the residue from
all
those
the
things.
new modern
There are a
things,
lot of questions out there. The one thing we know a lot about, we know about the toxicity of lead, and we know that there's no safe level of lead exposure, and the fact that we have it bringing what once was clean tap water into our homes, that should alarm everyone, especially when the city tells its own employees, if they're testing water for official federally mandated tests every 3 years, they tell their own employees to think about buying bottled water or buying a water filter if they have high levels of lead. They don't give that same advice to you and me. And I think that's a problem.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. We've gobbled up a whole hour. Do you know that? Can you believe that?
Time goes fast.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? Well, Michael, thank you so much. Michael Hawthorne from the Chicago Tribune. I always love having Michael on the show. He's got a lot to teach us. And like I said, look up his stuff. Michael Hawthorne at chicagotribune.com. We'll see you next time. We'll see you another time soon, I hope. Okay?
Great to see you.
All right,
Thanks.
You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It is a service of CAN TV, but not a lead service, just a regular old service. And we will be back again next week with another show, another discussion about Chicago. Hope you'll watch us. Don't forget, you can go to this address anytime and see any of our shows, which are now numbering somewhere. I don't know what it is, but today is our 7th anniversary. We've been doing the show for 7 full years.
That's awesome.
Can you believe that? Yeah. 7 times 50, that was 350, almost 400 shows. Bye. See you next week.